So, greetings to everybody. Everybody can hear me and see, and we've got it all. Okay, so we're going to cover a topic that is a little bit painful at the moment. It's the Red-Green Alliance, but also what's in between. And that's probably the most fascinating of all. So, and we know this is the anti-Semitism that we are facing. And, just the other day, right? There's synagogue burnings, there are attacks here and there. In particular, the diaspora is suffering. And it's a culmination of an enormous amount of anti-Semitism. So let's take a look. Okay, first of all, for those who know me, and even if you know, I'm not going to go over this too much. It's just my background. It's sort of been decided it should be put up every time we have a webinar that's being recorded. So anybody who goes in from the outside gets a look. Yeah, I've been here almost 50 years and did quite a few things, but we'll just continue onwards. For anybody who's new, stop here, take a look. You'll know who who's teaching these courses. All right. Okay, so let's begin. When I say the Red-Green Alliance, we really have to begin with the green. Why the green? Because that's Islam, and they have been here quite a bit longer than, let's say, the Reds, which would be, we speak about the communists. So just very, very briefly, you see at the top, there's the map of Islamic conquests, not the complete amount of conquest, because as we know, it starts in the Arabian Peninsula in the 620s. The Jews are the first enemy who happen to be destroyed, right? Do that in classes, whether it be anti-Semitism or Islamic Jihad. And later, there's the clash with the Christian West, first in the Byzantine Empire across North Africa into Spain, as well as moving into Hindustan. Eventually, India is captured, as many of you know. And what we don't have here quite, at this time period, because it only goes up to the 800s, the Balkans would be captured. Okay, it's known as a 1,000-year jihad with the caliphate. There are conquests, slaughters, and lots of discrimination against Jews and Christians as dhimmi people, but in particular, the Jews are seen in quite a negative light. Pagans, of course, are forced to convert. Now, what is interesting is down below, I have a painting from the Battle of Vienna, and that took place on the 12th of September, 1683, and that was the last, let's say, day as that battle took place. The 11th of September, we should say, is actually the last day that Islam had the upper hand as an imperial power with all its attacks against the West. And many people believe 9/11 took place specifically on that day to commemorate the last day when Islam had the upper hand against Christendom. Now, there are all these issues of liberation, okay? And Islam looks at it very much, Jihadi Islam. Liberation is submission to Allah and Sharia law. So you have to start with that. Remember, keep it in mind. We will continue. We continue here. Okay, so that's the green. Now, socialist, communist, anti-Semitism culminates in Stalinism. Okay, those are the reds. Now, what we want to point out here is that with the Reds, very often it's said, oh, well, communism and socialism wanted to make sure that Jews are equal. Yes, that was sort of like declared, but when you go to the socialist thinkers, the scholars, intellectuals, many of them were viciously anti-Semitic. And I managed to collect a few here. And we also discussed them more in depth in the course on anti-Semitism. You had Proudhon over here, French, his comment, it is not for nothing that the Christians call them deicides, meaning the Jews. The Jew is the enemy of the human race. One must send this race back to Asia or exterminate it. He's considered one of the fathers of socialism. You had Edward Drummond. Drummond was the one who pressed the anti-Semites against Dreyfus, right? The Dreyfus trial in the 1890s in France. And he was a hardline socialist, but he detested the Jews, okay? And he wanted to hang Dreyfus. I mentioned a few others here, different groups. This was a Russian anarchist group that supposedly should have been in favor of the Jews also. They were in favor of pogroms. Of course, there's Marx and then Stalin, who destroyed many Jews who were in his own political party, right, in making the revolution, as we know. Trotsky, the most prominent. They also throw in Kamenev and Zinoviev, two other Jews very involved in the Bolshevik Revolution. And we have, of course, Karl Marx, who comes from a Jewish background. We managed to get a picture of the stamp here from Vietnam. It's fine, because usually they have a picture of him just sitting there, with his big beard. So his famous comment that would be repeated over and over again about the Jews was, "Money is the jealous God of Israel, besides which no other God may exist." So what do we have here? We have the Greens, who start off. The first jihad is against the Jews, and the Jews are seen in a very negative light throughout Islamic history for some 1,400 years, 14 centuries. Secondly, when we go to the Reds, right, we speak of modern day socialism, communism, we see that at the baseline, many of them are anti-Semitic. And I'll venture to say not all, because Lenin wasn't, and there are others also who weren't. But it's there, okay? You could say it's with mother's milk. Anybody who's looking for anti-Semitism in not just the communist movement, but even the socialist movement, in democratic societies, we'll get to that in a moment, you'll find plenty of anti-Semites there. Okay, so we got it. Moving on. So those are two. Now, three, the third leg of this disaster is from Tsarist anti-Semitism to Nazism. So over here, I have a picture of a cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in Russia. Still Tsarist Russia. It's from the book covers 1912, before World War I. And it is the great forgery of saying that there are protocols, right? There's these memos of meetings between Jewish leaders who are conspiring to capture the world. This we'll go through in a moment, but we do need to mention from the outset and then at the end that Hitler wrote Mein Kampf with that in mind when he writes chapter 11, Race and Nation. And he just basically repeats this, but in his own words. Okay, so let's go through it for a moment. Okay, by the way, Protocols of the Elders of Zion is 75 pages. If you want to read it, I suggest to do so. It's unpleasant reading, but it's something everybody needs to know. Okay, and I can never emphasize it enough. We shy away from these sorts of things, and then when something really goes wrong, like, how did that happen? Okay, so it's said that Jews want to seize all the world's gold, the resources, and it's known as the despotism of capital. And that the Jews also foster economic wars. This is all a plot, right? They're planning it in order to capture the world either through communist agitation or control of world finance or capitalism. In other words, Jews are both communists and capitalists. Okay. In addition, the Jews have bought up the world media and press. The slogan that comes out of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, is there just to foster revolutions and global conquest. It's not to liberate anybody. As I say, it's a facade as far as they're concerned. And that all liberty, and these were the Jews in the protocol speaking amongst themselves and, like writing down notes, that all liberty will be curtailed, eliminated, communism, socialism, anarchism, and that even in supporting liberalism and freedom, that's to destroy the monarchies and to control the parliaments. In other words, everything's a plot. So Jews are in every single angle as a plot. And of course, some of those civic organizations that we're familiar with, whether it be the Freemasons or others, in particular, spoken about the Freemasons, that the Jews are using it in alignment with them to undermine the society. And finally, if we're doing this like, the major issues, Russia and the papacy, it's interesting, Russia is the Eastern Orthodox Church. So we're talking here of the Russian Orthodoxy, right? And the papacy, which is in Rome, right, are to be destroyed by freedom of conscience, right? That'll destroy them. Now, freedom of conscience is considered very, very evil. Hitler also relates to this, that the Jew is the most evil and the most dangerous because he has conscience, and that would undermine Nazism and the Aryan German right to world conquest. Right? People would doubt themselves. All right. So, and of course, he repeats all this in Mein Kampf, embellishes it in his own way. So we have all those three. Now, where do they come together? So let's begin with the middle picture. Is you have Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement. That's right before World War II. And here's Stalin shaking hands with the German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop. They seal the Nazi-Soviet alliance the last week of August in 1939. In other words, not even, I think it was exactly a week before the war broke out. And they end up splitting Poland. Everybody forgets about that. Okay. And on the left-hand side, we have a picture of Adolf Hitler meeting with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. And that's in November, the end of November 1941, after Haj Amin is forced to flee from the Palestine Mandate because he began a rebellion against the British. And of course, he was going to side with the Nazis. He flees when there's quite a bit of disturbances in the late 30s. Now, just to go through this briefly, you have the traditional, what had been, right? We go back close to 2,000 years, Christian and then the Islamic anti-Semitism. In a traditional way, the Jews are in exile. Why? Because they deserve it. They're being punished by God. We're taking this theologically. They're damned to hell. Then you move into, right, taking that and other aspects that we spoke about, right, coming out of, let's say, the left, right? It's also somewhat incorporated here. In the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the czarist Jew hatred and all those conspiracy theories that Jews control the world, either as capitalists or as socialist, communist, and anarchists, and through media and parliaments, you name it. And the Nazis take these protocols and explain it through racial theory. That's the idea. And Hitler writes it himself. We have all these ideas and theories, but a lot of it seems to be hocus pocus because he didn't particularly care for religion. He goes, but now we have scientific proof and racial theory. So you have Jewish subterfuge, world conquest, and all of this supported by the Muslim Brotherhood. Haj Amin wasn't exactly in the Muslim Brotherhood. They were a bit of his opposition even further to the extreme right and Islamist. He, of course, was viciously anti-Semitic, but so would be Hassan al-Banna and those who established the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 1920s and continue up through the 40s. And they're right. They are on the side of the Nazis. 20th century Islamist jihad revival. So here, when did it start? First of all, in the 1980s, you started to have what was known as the Palestine Committee getting organized. And it is not so much the PLO, but more the Islamists. In other words, those from Hamas. When 1993 comes along and the Oslo Accords, they spring into action because they have to destroy possibilities for peace. And they make it very clear. Okay. So they, first of all, what do they believe in? They're anti-democratic. Human rule equals paganism. That's the Islamists, jihadis. You have the same thing coming not only from Hassan al-Banna, who established them, but all the other thinkers, Said Qutb, and onwards. The Hamas covenant preamble is that world Jewry is the enemy. It does not say the Israelis or Zionists. Zionism is only one aspect of the diabolical schemes of the Jews. Okay, and when you read the Hamas covenant, it's very clear. All right. By the time you get to the 1990s and right through the 2020s, the whole plan here, we'll get to it in a second, of the Palestine Committee is for the destruction of democracy in the West, particularly in the United States, through civil, academic, and governmental jihad. But first, you really have to limit Jewish influence and basically destroy their standing in the West. Okay, and by the way, all this is contained in wiretaps that were taken during the meeting of the Palestine Committee in Philadelphia, October 1993, when they're discussing how to undermine and destroy the Oslo Accords and the possibility of a two-state solution and end of conflict, because they want continual conflict. So on the right-hand side, we have it here, right? You must destroy all possibilities for peace. no Oslo Accords, no two-state solution, weaken the Jewish community in the US to the point of subjugation, all right? And Islamization of America. In other words, you always have those together. You first go after the Jews and then destroy democracy. And here we have a picture of he who led this discussion and Palestine Committee, Omar Ahmed, who himself was, as I recall, it got into quite a bit of trouble with law, and afterwards, Musa Abu Marzouk, who's still around, he was in America, he was expelled, whatever, okay? But Ahmed was at the meeting, and Marzouk continued afterwards. Both of them terrorists. Okay, so we have the red, Marxism, Palestinian liberation. So now we have to bring this up to like sort of the ideas of where we are today. This whole idea of liberation, right? We said that in Islam, liberation is submitting to Allah. Well, here liberation is freeing everybody, supposedly, but it's always said to be against the Western democracies and against democracy. Okay, it's against them. It's equality through the dictatorship of the people or the proletariat. I wrote the workers, okay, but the proletariat. That's how Marx spoke about it. And it's the people who lead. The question is, who are the people? Those who choose themselves. They're self-assigned, as we know. So you have the collapse of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. As we know, even though China still exists, but today it's capitalist. So I have a picture here of Brezhnev and Mao. We often forget that amongst some of the worst anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union after the Stalinist era, of course, it was Leonid Brezhnev, who ruled for some 20 years, from the mid-60s to the mid-80s. Okay, now we go back to Marx. Judaism equals capitalism and is the ultimate primary enemy. Everybody needs to be liberated from Judaism. And this is a theme that's over and over and over again in the communist movement, that Judaism is capitalism. Liberate yourself from Judaism. And it's obviously, people say, okay, I have to liberate myself from the Jews because, you know, who holds on to Judaism? Christians? It doesn't make any sense. Okay. And there are lots of socialist, communist ideologues for sure, but socialist ideologues who are also anti-Semitic. And here, you know, not only was the communist East Bloc up until, you know, the early 90s, but I'll give examples of today. You know, I just thought of them off the top of my head. Jeremy Corbyn and Ken Livingstone, right? Livingstone had been mayor of London some 20 years ago. And Corbyn is still in parliament. He was forced out as leader of the Labour Party. The British Labour movement has an unbelievable amount of anti-Semites. I thought it was only them. In research I've done, I see it goes all the way back to the 1800s, that they always accused the Jews of supporting, you know, Imperial Britain, and that they're the ones benefiting from it. Okay. But what else are they saying? When we speak of Stalinism and these anti-Semitic communists and socialists, and once again, not all the socialists are anti-Semitic. We know of plenty of social democrats who are not, but still the roots are there. Jews are devoid of nationhood, homeland, and religion. In other words, where other peoples in the Soviet Union had an autonomous area, and yes, it was undermined by communism, no doubt, but they still had a cultural background. The Jews don't have anything. At one time, they were given an area way out by China called Boro-Bijan, but Stalin canceled it. I mean, he destroyed it. Okay, so Jews don't have culture or land or religion. They're not allowed to be connected to Israel, right? The hollowing out. You can be a Jew, but you have no content. And the Palestine National Charter speaks of this anti-imperialist colonialism, right? They're anti-imperialist, right? Against colonialism, we should say, against the West, and that Zionism and imperialism are allies. So they're anti-colonialist, meaning anti-Zionist, and they're all one and the same. So anti-Semitism and the destruction of Western democracies, because that's where it begins. Both the Reds and the Greens accuse the Jews of being full allies with the Western, quote, empires based on pluralism, meritocracy, and equality in the US, Europe, whatever else. And that's interesting. It's exactly, yes, it's true. We do believe in meritocracy. That's how a small, persecuted minority was able not only to prove themselves, but help build these countries in the age of nationalism, show loyalty, be part, come into being part of society. No, but that is resented, and that is seen as evil by the red-green alliance. And of course, that fascist overtones or undertones that you have there coming out of Tsarist Russia and then with Nazi Germany, all right? Because both the Reds and Greens demand the elimination, annihilation of democratic society. And that's what puts the Jews up front and center as the enemies. And it's not, quote, Zionism, right? The Jews, speaking of the Jews, the Greens and the Reds, they want dictatorial empires, and they say so, either in the name of Allah, as the Islamists, the jihadis say, or in the name of the people. And of course, these liberationists are ones leading the movement, the Reds. You see plenty of them in academic form on campuses, right? The academic staff, they do it in the name of the people, but they are the people. It's not like they're going to have elections. So, Jewish national liberation versus what is known as Palestinianism. Okay, and it's a new term. Actually, it's been around a while. The idea is how to define it. It's a bit of a problem. So everybody has the right to national liberation except the Jews. Only Zionism is condemned, that is an imperial movement. And after all, you're speaking of indigenous people coming home. Okay, because they're aligned with empire and imperialism, right? The Western democracies, as they say. In other words, you can't have a national liberation movement that wants to be democratic, that has good relations with the West. And even if they weren't, quote, aligned with the West, the fact that it, being Jewish would already mean that one loses legitimacy. Okay? The clash with the Palestinians, two parts. The Fatah secular Palestinians, right? The Palestine National Charter. Zionism is racism and colonialism. Hamas, jihadi, preamble, as we said before, Jews are the enemy. It's not just Zionism, right? Whereas the secular pretend it's not the Jews, but they're like the Stalinists. But the Jews have they have no real content, all right? Jews are rejected by Allah, or they're illegitimate. They're not a people or national entity, as Fatah says. Zionism in the Quran, interestingly enough, it exists, but it's contradicted and rejected. And the Jews are seen as an enemy of Islam and the world of liberation. In Palestinianism, the Palestinians themselves are used as a sacrificial vanguard, right here, for this Islamic Marxist revolution and to liberate everybody, but they're being put up in front and center. In other words, what you're saying is they're the human sacrifice. They're the people to be sacrificed with these others on college campuses cheering, or this leader, these far left leadership cadres, as they think they are, right, in the West, pushing them forward. They're the ones who are going to suffer. And what they say, no compromises, no two-state solution, and absolutely no peace. Total war, but in the guise of Palestinians, right, who themselves will be sacrificed for world conquest. In other words, what would happen if the Palestinian nationals and the Palestinian people be completely scattered? And by the way, a lot of them do live in the diaspora. They're constantly being pushed, and each war finds them in worse and worse shape. Challenge anybody to show me where the situation got better every time or each time that they attacked again. The only time that things were beginning to improve, we say, during the Oslo Accords, right? Trying to work things out with interim agreements. But of course, the Second Intifada in 2000 took care of that. And ever since, been problematic. Even when there's a lull, like we had in Gaza and West Bank or Judea, Samaria, there were certain uprisings. We know that from all the clashes in Gaza. If they just left things alone, Gaza could have done quite well. There were plans for what is known as a Singaporeization, all right? Developing the economy and everything. But no, the first objective was to destroy Israel. So I just want to read a couple of quotes here, or summarize in a way, right? From the Quran, just to show you that it supports Zionism. It says, we made the oppressed people successors of the eastern and western lands, which we showered with blessings. In this way, the noble word of your Lord was fulfilled for the children of Israel for what they had endured. And we destroyed what Pharaoh and his people constructed and what they established. Okay, right? The eastern and western lands of the Jordan River. And we have quote from Surah 17, verse 104. And we said to the children of Israel after Pharaoh, reside in the land. But when the promise of the hereafter comes to pass, we will bring you all together. In other words, there's a redemption in the end. Just keeps your covenant. Okay? Because they're not going to quote more than that. That's what it is. So Quran recognizes Zionism. Oslo Accords call for peace. Here, this is from the Accords, the beginning, right? Declaration of Principles. The government of the State of Israel and the PLO team, right? Jordanian Palestinian delegation at the time, representing the Palestinian people, agree that it's time to put an end to decades of confrontation and conflict, recognize their mutual legitimate and political rights, and strive to live in peaceful coexistence, mutual dignity and security, achieve a just, lasting, comprehensive peace, and historic reconciliation through the agreed political process. Okay, very, very significant. We have the Hamas covenant, where Jews are demonized fully. And I had quotes written up, but it would take far too long. You have your traditional Islamic anti-Semitism in the Hamas covenant. The Jew is seen as this anti-Messiah, fully demonized. The political construct is the same one. We speak of Tsarist Nazi mixed with traditional Islamic anti-Semitism, and recalling actually, and says as well, the protocols of the elders of Zion, which we know is also Mein Kampf afterwards. In the preamble, the Jews are said to be the enemy, we've said before. Article 22, that I always ask people to read, if nothing else, fully integrates this Tsarist Nazi and Islamic anti-Semitism, but it also has tinges of Bolshevism in the far left, because saying the Jews, are capitalist and control the world in revolutions. Article 7 comes right out of the Hadiths. The end of days, in other words, the end time cannot arrive until Jews are killed. And until then, there could be no messianic end time. So, of course, you want to kill the Jews. Full demonization. It's not a Zionist facade like PLO has. Here we have Sheikh Ahmed Yassin on the left and Yahya Sinwar on the right, and a picture of the Dajjal, the Islamic devil who's said to have only one eye. He's a cyclops. Palestine National Charter, and I don't go to the quoting here, okay? It also would take far too long. They had agreed to change the charter. President Bill Clinton went there in 1998, that December, and to be a witness that they voted to change it in order to have peace with Israel. What happened? It was canceled, or said to be, but never changed. So the argument is, in English, they say we canceled it. But in Arabic, they say we never change it. So it's still in effect, okay? It depends what language the discussion is going on. So Palestinians say, hey, it's still in effect. What does it say? It has 33 articles, as I recall. Article 20, Jewish people have no nationhood. It's completely denied. There's Balfour Declaration canceled. Jews are not a nation, only a religious community. But hey, what can you do? Full denial of the covenant. If there's no connection to the land of Israel, there's no covenant coming here, right? And it cancels out all, the holidays that are all around the exodus from Egypt and coming to the promised land. Article 21, they speak of only an armed revolution, no compromises, reject any solutions that don't advocate total liberation of Palestine. Article 23, Zionism, racist, fascist, imperial, and part of the international system of oppression against everyone, right? And Israel is the imperial outpost in the Middle East for those same Western democracies. So we now go back to Palestinianism and destruction of democracy in the West. Now, when we were dealing with this, and we were looking up, the Palestinianism, because I went to define it, I suddenly found that Dershowitz wrote a book in April, which I was not aware of. So we decided to put it up here. I don't think he'll mind a bit of, advertising. I haven't read it, of course. let's put it like this. Conclusion, my conclusions, okay, from doing this, call it research, investigations. First of all, the conclusion. The Jews are the oppressors, Israel's colonial, racist, fascist, imperial state. And the allies of empire, the US and Europe. But that we've said before, I can't repeat it enough, and I shouldn't repeat it too much. All right. The alliance that this Palestinianism is with the far left and your anarchists, all right, alongside, of course, as being part of, the Islamic movement. The objective: undermine the Oslo Accords, no two-state solution, no peace, just war. Palestinian liberation as a cover for war, not only against Israel and the Jews, but the West and empire. In other words, they're the sacrifice up front. You eliminate Jewish influence, right? Go after the West, as we said. And Islam and the people's role is sort of interesting, because if the two of them will control a society, who's going to get the upper hand? I'm not going to go into it. I believe that the Islamists would win, but that's a different story, taking it a couple steps down the line. And stage one, destruction of Israel and the Jews, right? Anti-Semitism never stands on its own. There's always a greater objective standing behind it. You go after the Jews first, and then your bigger objective, in this case, as we've said. Okay? They want a world dictatorship. And this global intifada, right, not only annihilates democracy in the West, but with the Palestinians as, quote, the vanguard in this global revolution, right, we have to ask, right, who else is getting liberated here? Is it just the Palestinians? They don't talk about anybody else. All the horrors going on, right? Africa, Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, and of course, plenty of other places not reported, or if they are reported, they don't get, nobody's running around demanding justice for Ukraine, okay? In university demonstrations. And then finally, conclusion, Palestinianism fronting for the Red-Green Alliance. It's a front, it's a facade for this world domination of the Red-Green Fascist Alliance. It is not Palestinian nationalism. Because the Palestinian nationalist would want to establish a state in Palestine. Okay? It doesn't want to be the sacrifice, right? In the name of capturing the world. Many Palestinians could choose peace. If you want a two-state solution, hey, it ain't going to happen with the Red-Green Alliance. And Palestinians, we sacrifice to the end, and will be forced, as we said, into constant war, and their suffering is only increased. All this Palestinianism, it's like people watching a boxing match, and one of the boxers is getting clobbered, bled to death, whatever. Think of it in the worst terms you want. And people in the crowd are cheering him on, right? Die for the cause, right? That's, I mean, I'm extremely cynical about this. I think it's horrific, all right? But that is what is going on. And the diagram here may be easy to remember, right? You have red, green, and what's in between? Your brown shirts, as the Nazis had been known, right? The SA. And when they overlap, right, green and red do become brown. But that's in the middle. Go back to the protocols of the elders of Zion, Mein Kampf, right? And you find that it all integrates, unfortunately.